Thanks for joining us, dear viewers. This is Open Horn of Africa's weekly program, which is Future Africa. I'm going to by hosting this program. Have a beautiful time with us. Today, I have one guest from a Zoom meeting. It's Dr.Derese Getachew. He's an associate professor of sociology and also an author. Many thanks for joining me and welcome to this program, Dr. Derese.
Thank you for having me. Welcome.
Well, just to begin with, who is the assistant professor Derese Getachew? Please introduce yourself.
Okay, thank you. I am a native of Ethiopia. I was born in Wallagga, and I came to Addis as at an early age, and I went to school there. And I was a sociologist at Addis Ababa University before I went to the United States. Currently, I'm teaching at a small liberal arts college outside New York City, known as Iona College. And as you can easily guess, I also actively participate, commenting on and giving, analysis on what is unfolding currently inside Ethiopia. Yes, so I'm a student of Ethiopian politics as well.
Good. Today we'll discuss about the current situation in the country, Ethiopia, its political and everything about. So yesterday, Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed Ali has joined the National Army to lead the fight against the tourist TPLF and its allied groups, internally and external forces. What is your reflection upon this point?
Well, as you know, Al-Kaba, this has been going on for a year. The war started with the unexpected aggression of the TPLF forces when they stormed the Northern Command. They massacred Ethiopian soldiers and they declared war on the rest of the country. The Ethiopian National Defense Forces, under the leadership of the Commander-in-Chief, Abiy Ahmed, has been responding back in kind. But following the withdrawal of the Ethiopian forces in June, the TPLF doubled down and made these incursions toward Afar and toward Amhara. And it brought a lot of damage, a destruction of property, the loss of lives. And still, the Ethiopian National Defense Forces were on a defensive posture, trying to give some chance and try to open some door for dialogue with the TPLF belligerents. My understanding is that the TPLF did not show the goodwill and respond in kind to the gesture that the federal government has offered to it under the leadership of President Obasanjo, AU Special Envoy. And so we have come to terms where, the Ethiopian National Defense Forces and the Prime Minister himself have to deal with the TPLF in the only language it seems to understand very well, which is force.
While leaving to the war front, the Prime Minister also called on Ethiopians and friends of Ethiopia, African country leaders to join him in the fight the African battle. And many people are also saying that Ethiopia is fighting an African battle. Do you agree with this point? And what does that mean for you?
Well, he has good reason to believe so. I'm not inside the government, but watching this unfold from outside, you cannot help but notice two things. The West, the so-called international community, has been decidedly silent about how the conflict originated, that the TPLF itself has initiated this war. It has also been silent about the human rights violations and the atrocities that the TPLF forces committed, including the Maikadra massacre, the attack on Amaras and the attack on Afars, and the destruction and the squalor that it brought upon on the nation, right? On the other hand, the West has been so vocal, pressuring the Ethiopian government, laying the blame on the footsteps of the Ethiopian government, and being biased in terms of its accusations against the government. So did the international media. The Western media like the cable news network, CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, you name it, they have been biased in terms of their coverage, impugning the Ethiopian government alone and exonerating the very actor that actually started this conflict and ended us in this mayhem and in this violence. So, it doesn't come as a surprise if the Prime Minister believes that the West has already decided to ally with these belligerents and is, waging a hybrid media information and also, aiding and abetting the TPLF forces. And so, it didn't come as a surprise for us We hope that the rest of Africa would listen. And we hope that the rest would also notice that it's today's Ethiopia's turn. Who knows whose turn it would be in the years to come.
Good. How do you see especially the decision of the Prime Minister, Dr. Abiy Ahmed, to join and lead the army? Especially, what is the implication for the rest of the public and including the army?
Listen, he comes from a nation, a generation where leaders stepped up to the plate and they themselves went to the battlefront. They did not stay behind. I mean, we can go back to thousands of years of history where Ethiopian leaders stood out and were at the forefront in the struggle to ensure the existence, the survival, and the continuity of this state. Now, we don't pretend Ethiopia is a perfect state. We understand we have our own challenges and problems. But none of us, no Ethiopian from any political dispensation believes that our fate should be decided by Westerners. Our fate should be decided by a group which is violent, which is authoritarian, which laid us for 30 years into all this dismay and tragedy, and now wants to come back to Addis by hook or crook and dictate terms. So if these internal enemies of the Ethiopian state ally with our external aggressors, right, it is incumbent on the prime minister to say this. And listen, I admire the fact that he took this decision. The fact that he said and he wrote this meant everybody throughout the country would be galvanized. I tell you what, moral would be really high on the side of the Ethiopian forces, and we are yet to see the outcome of this.
What should be the role of the African country leaders and all political actors to defeat or debate Ethiopia's fighting against the Western intervention and others?
Well, first, the African Union, which is headquartered in Addis Ababa, and African leaders, the most prominent of which include Senegal, Ghana, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Kenya, and South Africa, these, and including, of course, Nigeria, should take a leading and an exemplary role, mentioning to Western powers and actors that the Ethiopian government should not be pushed and should not be pressured. And this is a civilian and democratically elected government, right? The TPLF cannot and should not try to settle this through the battlefield. And that they should take a stand and say, listen, if this crisis has to be resolved, it has to be resolved in a way that recognizes the legitimacy of the government in Addis Ababa, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's government. I think that goes a long way. The second thing is, I think these African countries and leaders from the African nations should speak up and say the European and American forces, Western powers, are giving a biased and lopsided support to the TPLF, and they should call them out on that, right? So if Pan-Africanism and the struggle against Western and neo-colonial interference on Addis Ababa and on Ethiopia is to be thwarted, is to be averted, we need the support of other African nations. And my understanding is they are learning about the developments in Addis Ababa. They are becoming more and more conscious and aware of this battle, and that they will come through.
This last Sunday, thousands of Ethiopians and other Africans took on the streets of 27 cities of the 5 continents of the global, denouncing the Western interference into the Ethiopia's very domestic and internal affair, and also displaying their solidarity and showing love for Ethiopians. How was the rally, and what was the main message of the demonstration?
Well, let's step back and say this has never happened in the history of Ethiopia. Ethiopians of all colors, a majority of them, going out and protesting and demonstrating on the streets of Europe and America in their hundreds and thousands, and saying one thing, that the West is interfering in the internal politics of Ethiopia. It is giving a diplomatic, an intelligence, and a media support for the TPLF, and that Ethiopians from all colors are saying, we know this and the West should stop. And as you know, the sort of the overarching call was to say no more to Western interference and bias support against the TPLF. And now there's of course, the symbolic aspect of it, putting these governments on notice and telling them in words, in many words, that Ethiopians are aware of it and Ethiopians publicly disagree with it. But there's another aspect to this. I think in the Ethiopian diaspora, especially here in the United States, for the first time in history, the Ethiopian diaspora is translating its political capital into elections, right? A month ago, there was a gubernatorial election in Virginia, the Commonwealth of Virginia, and Ethiopians sided with the Republican candidate, which, by the way, is unprecedented. And the Republican candidate won because Ethiopian Americans who live in Virginia shifted from the Democratic Party into supporting the GOP candidate. And I tell you what, the chances that this would be repeated in Georgia, because there's an upcoming senatorial election. There is another one in Denver in Colorado. So Ethiopians are strategizing that Western governments, including policymakers and legislators in the United States, if they do not change their behavior, they would hear from Ethiopian citizens, Ethiopian American citizens. So, there's a lot going on, but Ethiopians are fighting back on all fronts, inside the country and outside the country.
With the same move, many analysts are describing the event, the demonstration even at the first moment that brought African voices together in recent history. What do you think affairs of this sides raise their voice under the normal slogan?
Well, like I said earlier, folks, who know about what is going on inside Ethiopia, how biased the Western media and Western governments have been in their support, in their tacit support, subtle support for the TPLF, citizens have been mobilizing all across the country. And it is this awareness and consciousness that sort of, led to the No More Global campaign, where, like I said, hundreds and thousands of Ethiopians and Eritreans and Somalis also joined in to air their disappointments and to sort of beam out their dissatisfaction with Washington, D.C., London, Brussels, all these Western policymakers. My hope is that these policymakers would take note and that they would change and they would amend their way, Olkaba.
The United States of America's embassy in Ethiopia is currently called on its citizens for the fifth time to evacuate from Ethiopia as soon as possible, claiming the security risk in Ethiopia. Why do you think the U.S. government wants to leave Ethiopia as fast as this? What is the reason behind this thing?
Well, two things. Now, let's be fair. As you know, usually international agencies and embassies are very much concerned about the security and safety of their citizens. And whenever they feel like a country is embroiled in war and civil war, and as they see it, the war has been inching towards the capital. So there's a great deal of fear and paranoia on the part of Western diplomats, and they're taking safety measures in order to protect their civilians, right? Now, is the threat as exaggerated and as drummed up as they think it is? I do not think so. Right. But there is also a significant section of Western policymakers who are using this to turn it again into, a news line, into a sort of a psyop, a psychological operation, trying to beam out to the rest of the world that, the rebels, the TPLF have approached Addis Ababa, that the capital city is unsafe, that the government is on its last legs, and to sort of create fear and paranoia in the public. Right? So there is this benign, sort of very technocratic aspect to it, but there's also this very subtle psychological operation going on, trying to have people be worried and anxious about the peace of Addis Ababa. And this is, by the way, not only targeted on Western, it's actually targeted on Ethiopians, right? And it's the one thing interesting about this war is how it has dual tracks. There is what is going on the battleground, right? The military front, but even much more powerful and much more damaging was the info warfare, which was launched against Ethiopia by the TPLF, by its lobbyists and Western media platforms, both print and electronic media platforms, which literally peddled anti-Ethiopian and anti-government rhetoric until today.
What do you think, or do you think that there's this continued pressure from the Western countries and the United States of America government and these allies will force Ethiopia to surrender?
Oh, no, Olkava. That would never happen. I mean, somebody should go and watch or listen from history. You know, this is not a country that breaks under pressure, right? We may not have much to boast about. We're not rich and prosperous, right? We may not have a lot of military might and weapons technology systems, but one thing is clear. Ethiopians would never, ever bow to foreign interference and meddling, right? In fact, the one thing that actually brings us together and stand together most of the times is when such undue external aggression and interference is imposed on us. Every single Ethiopian, I could bet my money in Addis Ababa, in Adama, in Awasa, now thinks that this is not about Abiy Ahmed. This is about Ethiopia. What Westerners fail to understand is that they think this is about the government. They don't understand this is about Ethiopians. This is about more than 110 million Ethiopians who are saying we are the ones who determine our fate, not folks in Mekelle, not folks in Brussels or in Washington, D.C.
Why the Africans have failed to stop this trend and for how long would the West continue to expose Africans in this disrespectful way?
Well, that's a very good question. Well, for Westerners to kind of give us the due respect that we need, I think they would like always to see what kind of power and what kind of status you bring to the table, right? So it's just to narrow this down to this conflict, which is now unfolding in Ethiopia. When the military battle brings victory to the Ethiopian side, let's say if the advances of the TPLF are halted and these cities which were occupied for the past month or so, like Dese or Kombolcha, are say retaken by the Ethiopian forces and the military balance of force is reversed, I'll tell you what, Western sources, diplomats and observers will adjust their reality according to that, okay? So we should know that unfortunately, what international relations kind of respects and beckons to and nods to is power, the kind of military and diplomatic power that you exert on the ground, okay? So when that equation changes, when that equation alters, so would the response of the international community to the Ethiopian conflict, and so would the kind of regard and respect that would accord to the Ethiopian government. That is my short-term response. But long-term, though, this is not only about Ethiopia, Wolkaba. Africa as a continent, which suffered brute forms of exploitation, beginning from slavery to colonialism and neo-colonial ties with Western powers, is still mired in poverty. It is still mired in conflict and violence. It is still mired in corruption, in authoritarianism. And Africa always expects food handouts, international aid, international loans from Western powers, right? These neo-colonial power relations have been there, they're still there, right? Until we get to that time when these relationships are going to be revisited and Africa musters its autonomy and musters its agency to extract itself out of poverty and powerlessness, unfortunately, this reality would continue.
Nowadays, the Biden administration, the current leadership of America is officially supporting the terrorist group here in Ethiopia, the TPLF group, which is threatening to overthrow the legitimate government of Ethiopia. And that is threatening to hit Ethiopia with some economic sanctions. Do you think this is fair?
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if the U.S., sanctions, Ethiopia, because as you know, this has been going on for quite some time now, right? First, they levied visa restrictions on unnamed Ethiopian officials, and then they said they would suspend Ethiopia from the AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunities Acts initiative that the American government passed 2 or so decades ago. And now they're threatening with more stringent sanctions against the Ethiopian government. I wouldn't be surprised if they say they're doing this to bring sort of peace and stability to the Horn of Africa. The irony is, none of these punitive measures are intended to punish the instigator of the conflict, which is the TPLF. That's the irony, right? If you're telling me that the international community's intent is truly, to bring common sense to these protagonists, the Ethiopian government and the TPLF, where is the carrot and where is the stick, right? The carrot is being assigned to the TPLF, right? Giving them coverage in the media, intel and other aids to the TPLF forces. The stick is punishing the Ethiopian government, right? So I wouldn't be surprised if they do that. But, Olkaba, at the end of the day, we are the masters of our destiny. We should stop thinking that the West is our reference point, that whatever they do is in our interest. History says it's not. Well, we may have incidents where our interests may align, right? We may have interest alignments, but more often than not, the West dictates the terms. So unless we get to that realization that, we are the masters of our own destiny and we chart our own path, I would not expect a lot of salvation from Western powers.
Good. Meanwhile, the US have also extended this economic sanction on the neighboring country, Eritrea, also in connection with the conflict in the northern part of Ethiopia, the Tigray region in this country. Is the US working to stop the growing relationship and integration of Ethiopia and Eritrea with each other and other countries of the region in the Horn of Africa?
Yeah, there's a lot of thinking going behind, why is US foreign policy so harsh and so punitive toward Addis Ababa? And people are floating all kinds of hypotheses. One is the US is in dire competition against China on the continent of Africa, and they want to have an Addis Ababa which is more pro-Washington, D.C. than pro-Beijing, right? Now, that hypothesis kind of fails because I don't see how the Abiy Ahmed regime is decidedly anti-Western. If you only look at the economic liberalization measures that Addis Ababa took since the coming of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, I don't consider him anti-Western in his ideology, right? There must be other variables. People mention what you just said, like this rapprochement, or reestablishment of political and diplomatic relations with Eritrea, the strong bond that the Isaias Afwerki regime now has with Addis Ababa. A lot of Westerners do not like that, right? Not to mention, the Horn of Africa agreement, which was signed between Asmara, Addis Ababa, and Mogadishu, and people feel like that is a scheme which would push Washington, D.C. out of the Horn of Africa, right? People also mention arguments like, there are TPLF stalwarts, folks who are in the U.S. foreign policy establishment. Some of them are kinfolk, some of them were old pals to the TPLF. I don't want to mention names, but we all know who they are, right? So TPLF links are to be blamed for these pro-TPLF bias in Western policy making. And then so the analysis keeps going on. But one thing we know is that the Eritrean government and the Eritrean nation is seen as the enfant terrible of the Horn of Africa. Westerners felt like the Eritrean regime is a rogue state and that it has to be isolated, that it has to be slapped with all sorts of sanctions. And they feel like the assistance that Asmara is giving Addis Ababa is actually a negative development, right? I don't see it that way because, for one, I don't believe isolating and marginalizing Eritrea is going to solve the problem because the TPLF poses an existential threat to Eritrea just as it does to Addis Ababa. The spoiler in real terms is actually the TPLF. So demonizing Eritrea, slapping them with more sanctions is not going to resolve the problem. It's not going to bring peace and stability to the Horn of Africa. It would actually do the opposite.
Yet, in the future, what should be the way for African countries, for Ethiopian diasporas living in abroad countries and all over parts of the world? What is expected from them in telling the real situation of this country to the global community?
Well, let's start from Ethiopia. You know, we have arrived at a stage where the two prominent ethnic groups, the Amharas and the Oromos, which between themselves probably have 60 to 70% of the Ethiopian population. And the elite from these two groups have come to an agreement that it is in the interest of everybody to have a peaceful and stable and democratic Ethiopia. There's also a consensus that, Ethiopia's politics should be determined in such a manner where we have a very strong, robust federal arrangement where national, regional states should exercise autonomy, collective rights like speaking in your own ethnic language, learning with it, right? Conducting business and self-government through it is important, right? We're not going to throw away the gains that had been made since 1991 when it comes to providing rights to nations and nationalities in Ethiopia, right? What we're going to do is not going to throw away all these gains and reinvent the wheel in Ethiopia, right? The challenge is you have a minority regime which was in power for more than 27 years and stayed in power by pitting these two groups against each other and everybody else, to be honest, and then was ruling this great country as proxy for Western interests, right? So long as Ethiopians realize that and ensure that there is a legitimate and a democratic government that represents them, they did that in the past election, right? And so long as Ethiopians deal with TPLF aggression effectively, and when hope and stability and peace comes back, I think we have to come back to the drawing table, Olkaba, and start seriously thinking about where do we want to go from here? How would our relationship with the rest of East African neighbors we have, Sudan, Eritrea, Somalia, South Sudan, and Kenya should look like, and Djibouti should look like? So that's our primary concern. And then what should Ethiopia's role be as one of the leading powers of the African Union, the seat of the African Union itself, and sort of a country which is always seen as a paragon, which is always seen as a place where freedom and liberty from neocolonial forces was found during the years of colonialism. We have to do that. We have to come back to the drawing table and think about all that. So there's a lot that remains to be done. But one thing I'm hopeful, Olkaba, is, given what we've been through, right? Given what we've been through the past 27 years, what the TPLF did over the past 3 years, and what Egypt and Sudan and its Western backers have done in Ethiopia the past 1 year or so, it's actually amazing that we have survived all these onslaught and where we are now, right? So I'm optimistic that the future holds a lot of promises for Ethiopia, and young people like yourself, Olkaba, are the future of Ethiopia.
Dr.Derese Getachew, Associate Professor of Sociology and an author. Many thanks for your time.
Thank you so much. Appreciate you for having me.
Well, dear viewers, this will bring us to the end of this edition. We highly appreciate you stay with our program. Till the next edition, have a beautiful time.